It's certainly good to see each one here tonight, and we trust that you have not come in vain. In fact, for that matter, I think we could even leave now and say it has been good for us to be here. Perhaps after studying a prayer that fell from the lips and came from the heart of one of the truly great Old Testament characters, we can say it's even a richer experience for our having been here. I got permission to make an announcement, and I'm going to make the announcement and then cancel out, I think, and just simply continue the study of prayer with the hope that some of you may have questions or comments that you would like to ask on prayer in general. We'll be studying the prayer of Daniel tonight, and through these last 2 or 3 days I've sort of lost my lesson. I mean, I know what we're going to talk about, what we're going to study about, but if you have certain questions on your outline and would like to have those questions answered, if I do not answer them as we go through the prayer itself, you feel free to raise your hand and ask the question, and we'll look at it together. And what I had intended to do tonight is the first Wednesday night in November, and we have 4 more Wednesday nights, and I was going to just out and out tell you that this is a fill-in arrangement. How many know how many one-chapter books we have in the Bible? Does anyone know? One-chapter books. How many? Someone speak. Sister Petty, you ought to know that. You let it slip your mind. Well, that's all right. Anyone else? How many one-chapter books? We have 5. And I was going to suggest that we... Pardon? Right. It's Obadiah in the Old Testament 1, and then Philemon, and 1st and, or rather 2nd and 3rd John, that's 4, and Jude, it's 5. And I thought we'd take each of these books, one each night for the remaining portion of the month, but we'd still have 2 chapters for one night. And I thought, well, why should we do that? We have plenty of prayers that we can study, but somehow in some way I would like for it to be brought down closer to where we live. In other words, if you have any kind of question that you would like to ask about praying, write it out on a card and hand it to me, and I'll be happy to look at it and consider it and come back next week and discuss it with you, or if not next week, at least one of the Wednesday nights before we close. So now I want to make an assignment for you for next week, and I apologize for not having an outline, but I have a real good reason for not having an outline for you tonight. And that's in 2 Kings 20. We're going to get acquainted with a marvelous person. At least, I think, a marvelous person. In those days was Hezekiah sick unto death, and the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, came to him and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Set thine house in order, for thou shalt die and not live. This disturbed Hezekiah tremendously. He wasn't ready to die. That is, he didn't want to die. And he prayed for extension of life. And I'm not going to tell you any more about it because I want you to find out for yourself. I want you to study it. Study the prayer of Hezekiah, and let's study not only the prayer, but Hezekiah as well in the light of the prayer. Find out all you can about the man, and then this particular prayer that he prayed for an extension of life. Notice something of his attitude, and I'm sure that while we may not be necessarily praying for the same things, and certainly not under the same circumstances that the Old Testament characters prayed. We still are human beings, and basically we're all the same. And the spirit that characterized those wonderfully holy prayers under the Old Testament era should in some way throw some light upon our pathway today. So that's the purpose of studying these. And now tonight, we want to turn to the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel and study a prayer that Daniel the prophet prayed. You remember Daniel was one of those young men, there were 4 of them altogether, that is, that are identified, that is related in this book, who were taken captive when Nebuchadnezzar came down and overcame the city of Jerusalem. And the information that we have about them impresses upon our mind the fact that they were promising young men. They were men of ability. They were men that could be educated, could be schooled, and they wanted them for this purpose. They wanted to train them so as to make them efficient men in the kingdom of Babylon. And they were very young at this time. We do not know exactly how old they were or how young. But if they had been, let's say, 20, which I doubt they were, in our lesson tonight, we're dealing with a man who is somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 years old. If they were maybe 15, then a man somewhere in the neighborhood of, let's say, 80 to 85 years of age. Because the time was almost consumed that God intended for the Israelites to remain in captivity. And Daniel went into captivity in the very beginning. Notice in the very first part of the chapter of the 9th chapter of Daniel, in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came unto Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolation of Jerusalem. There's something about this that's attractive to me. He said, I discovered this through the reading and the consultation of books. Now, I'm sure that he had the benefit, of course, of Jeremiah's testimony, and then perhaps there were certain records that he had access to there in the kingdom. And he had an idea that time perhaps was just about fulfilled. And so he made a purpose in his heart to find out all he could about it. God said something is going to happen 70 years from now. And those 70 years have just about passed away. And Daniel's interested. And so the books that were necessary for him to consult, he consulted in order to find out more. And you know, this reminds me that on that marvelous morning in Jerusalem, now almost 2,000 years ago, Jesus ascended up into heaven, and Peter just a few days later, not on Pentecost, but shortly thereafter, said that the heavens are to retain him until the restoration of all things, and then he is to return. And I do not know how many years it will take to accomplish God's purpose. in having Jesus come back to heaven and wait. And whether we have 2 more thousand years to go, or 3 or 10, I do not know. But in a sense, for all of us, it will not be very long anyway, because however death finds us, that's the way it's going to be. And it could be that He may even come in our lifetime. And it would seem to me, if there's any way for us to have any general idea of His coming, I'm not talking about the time now, just simply establishing in our mind more firmly the fact that Jesus will return, that He is coming. We'd want to spend time studying books in order to acquire this knowledge. That is, we learned this from Daniel. Daniel was studious. He wanted to find out. And I think we can learn this from Daniel. This is the type of man we're studying about tonight. He wasn't willing necessarily to listen to the other person. If there were any way for him personally to investigate this thing, he wanted to do it. And this, I think, is a great lesson for us. In the 2 Chronicles 36, if you want to find 2 Chronicles 36, we will read a verse or two here. Uh, 36 and 21. In the 20th verse it says, "And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept Sabbaths, to fulfill 70 years. So 70 years were involved, and it's because Israel had desecrated the Sabbath. That's this one great reason why they were allowed to be carried into captivity. I want to make just a passing comment here. We'll eventually get to his prayer. It really disturbs me, even though sometimes I find myself maybe partaking of this to a degree. I try to refrain from it. You know, there's very, very little difference today in the way, I suppose there's no difference in the way the world looks upon the Lord's Day and the other days of the week. And I can remember that it was a customary thing just every few Lord's Days to have it called to our attention that we should be in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, and our attention was focused upon the fact that this is the Lord's Day. Jesus laid down a wonderful principle when he was talking to the Pharisees. They said, shall we pay tribute to Caesar? And if he had said yes, of course the Jews would have turned against him. If he'd said no, the Roman government would have turned against him. And he was in a dilemma in their mind. But he said, give me a penny. And he looked at the penny and he said, whose superscription is on this coin? And they said, Caesar's. And he said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God's the things that are God's. I believe that this is a principle that we ought to give some thought to. When I was just a little boy, and I really appreciate these lessons. I don't know why they come to my mind so clearly today. I guess they say when you get older that you remember those things more clearly. But I've found them very helpful in my teaching all along. I remember having heard a man many, many years ago in Ferndale, Michigan, who said, suppose a man were to give another man $6 of the $7 that he possessed. And then he had put his one remaining dollar in his pocket and turned to walk away. And the man to whom he gave the other 6, seeing a portion of that dollar sticking out, just reached over and very easily slipped it out of his pocket and put it with his other 6. He said, what would you think of a man like that? The man had already given him 6 of the 7, and now, without the man knowing it, he stole the 7th. You know, the Lord has given us 6 days in the week. How do we spend His day? We cut the grass? Do we go fishing? Do we go to the ball game? Do we... In other words, some people have the idea, as long as we give to the Lord just 1 hour, and we don't want it to be over that, then we have it made. We're living in perilous times. And we ought to be thinking more about how we should observe the Lord's day. It's His. He has given us 6. You can do with them whatever you please so long as it's legitimate. But what about His day? Do we have a right to that one also? Can we do with it as we please? You cannot tell the difference in the days by driving down the highways, by the stores that are open, by the activities that are going on. There just simply isn't any difference. And you see, living in this kind of environment, we, not intending to perhaps, and not even willingly, we partake of this spirit. Now, Israel suffered for 70 years because they desecrated the Sabbath. And I know that the Lord's Day and the Sabbath are not to be viewed exactly alike. I'm fully aware of this. And we cannot bind on Christians regulations identified with the Sabbath. But I do think one of the grander statements that we have about the Lord's Day in the New Testament is the statement that is made of that wonderful saint who was a prisoner on the Isle of Patmos, simply a rock out in the Aegean Sea for all practical purposes. He said, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. Not just an hour, not just 30 minutes, but he said, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. And the implication is that because he was in the Spirit on that day, he received the marvelous blessing that you and I are appreciating today as we study this very wonderful book of Revelation. Well, Daniel has spent most of his lifetime in Babylon as a captive. He had a lot of advantages because he was a gifted person. But the time is just about consumed now, and he's concerned, having studied some books. So let's notice some of the things that are said following this. He said, I set my face unto the Lord God to seek by prayer and supplication with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. And I prayed unto the Lord my God and made my confession and said, O Lord, the great and dreadful God, keeping the covenant and mercy to them that love Him and to them that keep His commandments. We have sinned. You know, I was impressed tonight when I heard the statement read that I have sinned. It's hard to get people to say I have sinned. It's hard to say I have sinned. It isn't hard for me to tell you that you've sinned, but to get me to say that I've sinned. And I think I mentioned this before, but this bears repeating. It doesn't take a man or a woman to sin. Anyone can do that. But it takes a real man and it takes a real woman to say, I have sinned. Well, Daniel knew they had sinned. And he's praying not only for himself, but he's praying for his people. And that's just about one of the first things he says. We have sinned. He says, we have sinned and committed iniquity and have done wickedly and have rebelled even by departing from thy precepts and from thy judgments. Neither have we hearkened unto thy servants the prophets, which spake in thy name to our kings and our princes, our fathers, and to all of the people of the land. O Lord, righteousness belongeth unto thee, but unto us confusion of faces, as at this day to the men of Judah and to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, And unto all Israel that are near and that are far off, through all the countries whither thou hast driven them, because of their trespass that they have trespassed against thee. You know, the Lord came to Israel after He led them out of the land of Egypt, and He made some very strange promises to them based upon some rather strange conditions, and threatened them with rather strange threatenings. The beautiful side of it is, He said, now if you follow me, if you abide by my law, then I'll bless you. And I'll bless those who bless you. And He said, if you violate my law, I'll curse you. And of course He said, I'll curse those who curse you. That is, in other words, I'll bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you. And if you violate my law and go away, then I'll curse you too. And one of the most unbelievable things, I guess, He said, if you violate my law and leave me, you'll become so inhuman that the day will come, because of your punishment, unbearable punishment, that you'll eat your own offspring. That sounded so utterly unbelievable. But that's the very thing that happened on different occasions, and especially in AD 70 when Jerusalem was overtaken by the Romans. And Daniel is no doubt reflecting upon this promise as well as the threat. He said, we have violated your law. We have done wickedly. We have sinned. And of course he is praying for forgiveness. He said, Lord, to us belongeth confusion of face, to our kings, our princes, to our fathers, because we have sinned against thee. To the Lord our God belongeth mercies and forgiveness, though we have rebelled against Him. That is, God is still willing to hear, and God is still willing to forgive, if we are penitent. Neither have we obeyed the voice of the Lord our God to walk in His laws, which He set before us by His servants, the prophets. Verse 11, yea, all Israel have transgressed thy law, even by departing, that they might not obey thy voice. Therefore, the curse is poured upon us, and the oath that is written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, because we have sinned against him. There's something else here that I want to call your attention to. Moses gave to Israel this law about 900 years, almost 1,000 years before this. And yet they're concerned with this law here, 1,000 years later, because this is the law that they've transgressed. Almost 1,000 years have gone by, and Daniel is concerned about the law of Moses and the fact that he says we have departed from it. Once you learn those first 5 books of the Old Testament, you're never far removed from them, regardless of where you're studying in the Bible. And I do not mean by this that you and I are answerable to the law contained in those books, but we certainly need to know that law and the people to whom it was given, and their weaknesses and their frailties and their strengths and their faith. We need to know all we possibly can about them, because this will help us in living the Christian life. Perhaps people thought as time passed on that God had forgotten what He said at Mount Sinai. But He didn't. And He hasn't forgotten what He said 2,000 years ago either. Whatever He promised us through the testimony of the Lord, those men that He sent out, we can be absolutely certain that He'll fulfill. And His delay is not His neglect. He's doing this deliberately. The long suffering of God is not proof that He's sleeping. But it's the fact that He's not willing that any should perish, but that everyone should come to repentance. So He's concerned about the lost even here. And so while some 1,000 years almost had passed by, still they have this law before them, and they've departed from it, and this caused them to stand before the Lord as sinners, as men of iniquity, as men of wickedness, as men of rebellion. Now, if this were true with reference to the law of Moses, that was dedicated simply by the blood of animals, how much more is this true with respect to the New Testament that has been dedicated by the blood of Jesus Christ Himself? And you and I are, in a sense, subject to this. The question is, how are we treating it? How am I treating the law of Christ? How are you responding to the law of Christ? Do we really put God first in our lives? Are we really seeking the kingdom of heaven and God's righteousness, as Jesus says we ought to, believing that all the other necessary things will be added unto us, or do we give them preference over the kingdom? Now, Israel had to suffer when she departed from the law of Moses. Do you think that we're going to be exempt from suffering if we depart from the law of Christ? If we ignore His law? Obviously not. And now notice further what he says. And He hath confirmed His words. That is, He's shown them to be true. How did He do this? Which He spake against us and against our judges that judged us, by bringing upon us a great evil. For under the whole heaven hath not been done as hath been done upon Jerusalem. You know, it will be so sad for us to live in such a way as to cause God to confirm His word unto us by showering down upon us the punishment that He says the wicked will have if they fail to obey Him. But you surely recognize Him as a just God. As Abraham said, will not the judge of all the earth do right? Yes, He will. And God is not going to condemn those people back there for violating the law of Moses and disregarding it, and then excuse us for walking underfoot the covenant of grace. It would seem to me as though reading prayers like this and revelations of God like this, that our assemblies would be overflowing every time the church comes together. Surely these things are not in our minds. Surely we're foreign to them. They're foreign to us. Instead of having to beg people to come to religious services, all of us ought to be out telling the lost of their terrible plight unless they do something about their salvation, and having them brought in too. There will be no escape. There's no escape from death, and there's no escape from the judgment. And you know, I've heard all of my life, and I'm sure that you've heard at least a good portion of your life, if not all of your life, as far back as you can remember, we ought to live a certain kind of life. And we ignore it. We don't pay it much attention. One reason why we have this material here is to remind us that God's still here. Had a man ask me one time, I was a very young man, had never had such a question asked me before in my life. Learning that I was a minister, he said, well, do you believe in the God of the Old Testament? Well, that shocked me. I never heard that question before. I said, of course I do. Well, he said, I don't believe in the God of the Old Testament, but he said, I believe in the God of the New Testament. Well, now, you know that's really stupid. That really is. Now, his idea is the God of the Old Testament is a God of justice, a God of wrath, a God of anger. But the God of the New Testament is a God of love, a God of mercy, a God of forgiveness. But the Bible reveals one God, and there isn't anything in the world, I suppose, that the devil would rather us believe than that the God of the New Testament is merciful and loving and will never cause anyone to be brought to justice. Do you think for one moment that the God of the New Testament, by that I mean the God that's spoken of in the New Testament, do you think for one moment that He's simply a God of mercy and not a God of justice in light of His allowing His only beloved Son to die upon the cross? This to me demonstrates God's feelings with reference to justice and to righteousness. He's the same God. And if He dealt with the people of Israel as He did here, you and I can be certain that He's going to do in much the same way to all others with reference to the law of Christ. But again, I want to emphasize that wherever you are in the Old Testament or New, after you read those first 5 books, you never get far removed. Notice the next verse. He says, as it is written in the law of Moses, all this evil is come upon us, yet made we not our prayers before the Lord our God, that we might turn from our iniquities and understand thy truth. We haven't done what we ought to have done. Therefore hath the Lord watched upon the evil and brought it upon us, for the Lord our God is righteous in all of His works which He doeth, for we obeyed not His voice. And that's our problem. We obeyed not His voice. Now, you cannot look into my heart and know whether or not I'm sincere even now as I speak. You don't really know me. I want to be honest. I want to be sincere. I want to be all the way through and through what you see on the outside. That's what I try to be. But you still don't know that. And I do not know you. I cannot look into your heart and see what you are. But each one of us knows himself. You know what you are. And you know what place you're giving God in your life. And you know whether or not God is getting first place and first consideration. And it seems to me as though prayer such as this and material such as this should so stir our minds that we would want to make a very careful inventory of ourselves before Him, that we might have greater assurance in our own hearts of that shall rush to home after a while. Right, exactly right. Paul said things written aforetime were written for our learning. Well, now this is one of those things. Does God overlook the sins of His people? No. Is God willing to forgive? Yes. But He's not willing to forgive those who continue in the practice of sin. And unfortunately today we have just sort of lost sight of what sin is. You know, some years ago someone came up with the idea of what happened to sin. We don't have any drunkards anymore. They're all alcoholics. We don't have any fornicators or adulterers. They are just simply people who are somewhat promiscuous in their activities. We don't have any thieves anymore. They're kleptomaniacs. And well, you can talk about this in the living room. You know, everything's legitimate, everything's wonderful, and sin's just disappeared. But sin is there in its same ugly nature with simply a new name, and it can destroy our souls. But that's all the time we have, and certainly good to be with you, and thank you so much. If you have any question, any comment about prayers, be sure and talk to me about it. And prayers that we offer up how we might help our prayers today in the church, improve them, and so on. Let me know what you think.